I began with the intellectual origins of a tension that has underscored our understanding of justice and politics since its first articulation by the ancient Greeks. In other words, since the beginnings of written history on the subject. On one side of this long-standing antagonism is the belief that might makes right, that superior power justifies the pursuit of political interests, regardless of chosen means. The opposing view is that all humans are bound by laws that include moral considerations. I concluded last night's talk with an analysis of the Nuremberg Tribunal, the first large-scale effort in history to stay the hand of vengeance in the aftermath of war in favor of international courtroom trials. When Nuremberg defined and codified crimes against humanity for the first time, and when it concluded that individuals may be held responsible for breaching universally understood norms of human behavior, the tribunal explicitly rejected the theory that might makes right. Once again, I can't think of a better way of conveying the drama or introducing you to the issues than a short reading, this time from The Sun Climbs Slow. So I'll begin with a few paragraphs from the chapter titled The Inauguration. It is March 11th, 2003, and close to 1,000 dignitaries, human rights activists, and representatives of 89 states from around the world have arrived in The Hague, Holland, a city that has been celebrated since the 17th century as a center of international diplomacy and a refuge for persecuted minorities. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they begin to assemble in the ancient Hall of Knights, the medieval parliament of the Netherlands. The excitement in the room is palpable as the invited guests parade down the center aisle to their velvet-covered seats. The world's first permanent international criminal court is about to be formally inaugurated. Representatives from more than half the countries in the world have come to mark the birth of the most important institution to penetrate the global sphere since the creation of the United Nations in 1945. The mandate of the new tribunal is to mount an assault on the age-old scourge of criminal impunity on behalf of the peoples of the world. We rise as Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands is escorted down the aisle. United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan also takes his seat in the front row. The new court is the creation of global multilateralism, and Mr. Annan has been a strong supporter. This is fortunate, for although the UN will not control the workings of the International Criminal Court, the tribunal will need its backing. With no police force or such other operational support, the ICC will depend entirely on the moral, tactical, and financial support of the international community. Also seating themselves in the front rows are the 18 newly elected judges of the court, representing 18 countries across the globe. 1 month earlier, it took 33 rounds of ballots for the nations that had signed onto the Rome Statute, the treaty that established and underpins the ICC, to elect these men and women. One country is conspicuously not represented in this room. The absence of the United States is glaring. The American ambassador to The Hague wrote to say he would not attend. A spokesman for the court announced earlier to the assembled media. The brittleness in his voice was unmistakable. Now Prince Zayed Ra'ad Zayed Al Hussein, Jordan's representative to the United Nations, approaches the podium. His country's record on human rights is less than sterling, but his own commitment to the rule of law, and to the ICC is passionate and personal. He is the current president of the Assembly of States Parties, made up of the 89 countries that have ratified the Rome Statute. He alludes almost immediately to the impending war in Iraq, the other event on everyone's minds. At the very moment when our planet lives with the very grave challenges threatening international peace and security, we assemble here to confirm once again our commitment to the international rule of law. Yet as humanity progressed toward the achievement we celebrate today, people throughout the world continued to suffer horrifyingly from genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, a constant reminder of what needed to be done. In a few simple words, Prince Zayed has articulated the sense of urgency that characterizes this historic event and the high expectations for the court. These include the hope that the tribunal will help to deter future genocides and related crimes, that it will be fair and transparent in all its dealings, that it will create an accurate historical record of the cases it tries, and that it will formally acknowledge the civilian victims who have survived the crimes. When all the judges of the court have been sworn in, Kofi Annan moves slowly toward the podium. Speaking in a slow voice, he articulates the meaning of the ceremony we have witnessed. It has taken mankind years to reach this moment, he says. These 18 judges from all regions of the world and many different cultures and legal traditions have made themselves the embodiment of our collective conscience. Then he addresses what may be the most difficult problem the new court will face: the inherent tension between the pursuit of justice, including accountability and possible reconciliation, and the political exigencies of brokering peace when a conflict ends. There are times when we are told that justice must be set aside in the interest of peace, he says. It is true that justice can only be dispensed when the peaceful order of society is also secure. But we have come to understand that the reverse is also true. Without justice, there can be no lasting peace. Well, I hope I have successfully conveyed the excitement that attended this extraordinary event, along with a tantalizing hint about the hostility of the American superpower at the time. America, I should add, was not the only hostile power. China, Russia, and India also were opposed in varying degrees. You heard a little about the infrastructure of the tribunal, including the fact that the judges are elected, and a brief reference to the fact that there is presently no international police force that is capable of arresting indicted suspects. With this brief overview into operations, and with the historical context I hope I provided last evening, I think you will enjoy hearing the story of how a transnational court came to be in a world of jealously sovereign states where power is supreme. For nothing in the past 2 millennia of recorded history ever suggested such a likelihood. In fact, no one was more surprised by the successful birth of the ICC than the men and women who labored to bring it about. It is a story that serves to remind us about the volatile nature of international affairs, just in case we suffer under the delusion that we live in a predictable world. Here is the edited version of this remarkable story. For the unedited version, you'll have to buy this on Climb Slope. So let us transport ourselves back to the 1940s, to the end of the Nuremberg trials. Although their legacy indisputably changed the world, they were a one-time wonder. The trials had a beginning, a middle, and most importantly, for the great powers of the day, an end. For as we saw last night, the victorious Allies had no intention of seeing their own war crimes prosecuted. But idealism was in the air in the post-war 40s. The United Nations was born in 1945. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948. The Genocide Convention was passed in 1949. So while the world was still in shock at the atrocities revealed in the Nazi concentration camps, some people began to wonder whether it just might be possible to base the post-war international order upon a framework of global law. Why not create a permanent court, just like Nuremberg, they asked? A tribunal with the capacity to prosecute the major crimes Nuremberg had addressed that were even then being incorporated into international law. Interest grew. And in 1948, the new United Nations created a legal committee to draw up what was called a draft code of offenses against the peace and security of mankind. But how many of the world's movers and shakers really wanted a permanent international tribunal? Look at it this way. The powerful states of the Security Council cherished their sovereignty above all else. They feared that a permanent international criminal court with a mandate to monitor major abuses in the international arena might interfere with their ability to pursue their national interests in ways of their choosing. Starting in 1950, the legal committee known as the International Law Commission brought draft after draft of its work to the UN General Assembly for approval. Each time they were sent back to the drawing board. Yes, the member states agreed that the proposal was achievable, perhaps even desirable. But, they said, it was not practicable. This was diplomatic code. Translated into plain language, it meant that while it might be a good idea to have such a court, there was a war raging on the Korean Peninsula, and Cold War politics, as well as Westphalian sovereignty, would stand in the way. Most of the permanent members of the Security Council, the same great powers that had created the Nuremberg Tribunal, were opposed. Joseph Stalin was still dispatching millions of his own citizens into the Gulag or the next world. He thought this was a very bad idea. The United States wouldn't hear of it. Among the permanent members of the Security Council, only France evinced real interest. At the core of the rejection lay the problem of finding an acceptable definition of the crime of aggression, since no power would agree to be subject to international law if that meant curtailing its ability to achieve its desired ends. For 40 long years, there was not even a flicker of interest within the United Nations. Not until 1989. That was the year Arthur Robinson, then the president of Trinidad and Tobago, suggested that the UN create an international criminal court to prosecute transnational drug running. Narco-trafficking threatened to overwhelm his small country. The United States was interested in the drug issue. As we know, the Berlin Wall crumbled that same year, signaling the imminent end of the long Soviet experiment. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, after which the ties that had bound nations to one or the other side of the Cold War divide quickly frayed and loosened. Starting immediately, there were civil wars, inter-ethnic wars, purportedly religious wars, and wars over the control of wealth-producing natural resources. New genocides raged in Bosnia and Rwanda, followed by other catastrophes, an explosion of war and civilian calamity that trailed unspeakable human misery in its wake. For civilians were no longer the accidental victims of war. They had become its targets. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were 8 military fatalities for every wartime civilian death. During the Second World War, there were equal numbers of civilian and military deaths. Now the situation has reversed. Since the early 1980s, civilian deaths have outnumbered military deaths by 9-1. By 1993, it was impossible to deny that atrocities reminiscent of the Nazis were once again taking place in Europe. Traditional diplomacy simply wasn't working. The UN was desperate to do something, anything, and that was when the world body remembered Nuremberg. If it is the job of lawyers, academics, prosecutors, and judges to participate in the workings of such judicial institutions, to investigate situations, indict putative perpetrators, ensure the fairness of due process trials, and establish case law precedents that will serve future justice. One of the great pleasures of being an independent writer has been the freedom to follow the tendrils of my private interests. One of these interests has been an attempt to understand the subjective experience of both the victims and the perpetrators of these almost unimaginable crimes. For it has long seemed to me that both groups have much to teach us about our human capacities as well as our susceptibilities. So I hope you will allow me a short digression with such thoughts in mind. I traveled twice to Bosnia to explore the meaning of international justice on the ground, so to speak. My first visit was in 1997, just 2 years after the Dayton Accord purportedly brought peace to the region. I say purportedly because it was still dangerous, as I discovered to my chagrin. By the time I made my second trip in 2004, the ICTY had already been operating in The Hague for a decade. I wanted to ask survivors of the 1995 Srebrenica genocide what justice meant to them. Did it help them to see perpetrators on trial? Here are 2 fragments taken from many encounters. One young Muslim survivor who had worked as an interpreter at the ICTY told me that when he listened to one of the perpetrators of the Srebrenica genocide express remorse in the courtroom, he cried uncontrollably with relief. For the perpetrator's expression of repentance had turned a world gone mad and strange into a more recognizable place he could inhabit with greater psychological comfort. He also told me that before the ICTY was established, Bosnians believed the old adage that all's fair in war, that regardless of what they did, there would be no consequences. The tribunal in The Hague had changed that perception, he said. It was challenging the impunity of people who had committed unspeakable crimes. Its very existence was a deterrent, he said. Through evidence and courtroom testimony, the tribunal was also establishing a record of what actually took place during the war years, making future denial not impossible, of course, but less likely. That consoled him, he said. My second experience had little to do with the courtroom. At the Forensic Center near Tuzla, where scientists matched the DNA of survivors with the scattered bones that were collected from mass graves, I watched a Canadian forensic anthropologist piece together the final elements of a human skeleton. The boy was 18 years old when he was murdered, she told me. The scientists know that by the look of the pelvis. In a day or so, they would be able to return his name to him. Then they would call his mother, and she would come to take him home. To recover a name, to return the remains of a child to a grieving parent, that too, it seemed to me, was a kind of justice. What I learned from people who were grappling with life in the aftermath of genocide is that justice may be multi-layered and fragile, and that it can sometimes restore a wispy remembrance of what life used to be. Last night, I spoke about the constant paradox inherent in global affairs. I pointed out that justice was done in the famous Nuremberg courtroom, even though it was partial justice. And that ironically, the ICC was inaugurated just days before President Bush illegally invaded Iraq. There is never a shortage of paradox. All the same, in spite of war and continuing abuses, the powerful message of international criminal justice is growing louder. Those who commit crimes against humanity will be judged by humanity. That is the trend in these early years of the 21st century, in contradiction to the sometimes chaos that we see around us. Our children and grandchildren will know whether or not it succeeds. Thank you very much.